name is Greg Borzo, and I'm chair of the programs for the Midland Authors. And that's an organization, in case you're not familiar with it, founded in 1915. And we're a group of authors who work to connect authors with authors and authors with readers. We do that through programs like this. We have a website, midlandauthors.org, and we have a newsletter, things like that. So I'd like to ask everybody who might be interested in learning more about Midland Authors or attending our programs in the future to sign up on the email sign-up sheet. I'll put it back on the end of that table where the food is, and then we'll just keep you posted on what's coming. I want to thank Syed, our moderator, for bringing these folks together, illustrious panel, and I'll introduce him in a bit. But Tsehaye Hebert is one of our panelists, and she organized the idea of having a sign language interpreter. Great idea, something we haven't done in the past, and maybe something we should think about doing in the future. So thank you so much for suggesting that, and then not just throwing it on live, but you made it happen. So I don't know how you pull that off. So our interpreters are Walter Matthews and Ann Wolmuth. So welcome to both of you. Thank you for coming and opening our eyes to this new priority that we should be very, very aware of. So that's about it from me. At this point, I will introduce our moderator, Syed Haider. He is a very prolific author and very, very well-connected individual. And so his short stories and essays have been widely published and anthologized by Oxford University Press, Milkweed Editions, Penguin Books, Pearson, and Longman Literature. He's the author of novels, To Be With Her, and the novel Life of Ganesh. When not working on his own writing, he keeps busy as the founder and senior editor of the Chicago Quarterly Review. And when I talked to him the other day, he described himself now as peacefully retired. But I don't believe it, because he's doing so much. He's working on another novel. He's bringing people together like we are tonight. So please welcome Syed. And we have one mic, so we'll pass it around. There you go.
Well, thank you, Greg, for this wonderful introduction. I don't know if I deserve it, but it's always nice to hear good words about yourself. Also, I want to thank SMA for organizing this and making it home for us. It's an honor to be a member of this group, as well as, I don't know, as the joke goes, why would anybody want me to be a member of this group? But I'm very happy to be a member. My task, among other things, is to talk about Chicago Quarterly. Well, Chicago Quarterly was born out of desperation. And I'll tell you briefly about the desperation. There were so many of us who went to University of Chicago. This was before they had the formal writing program. Now it's at least two-year program, but we took courses with this woman named Mali Ramanujan. She was a great teacher. And so many of us took one class with her, then the second, next. And almost 2 years passed with different classes we took. And at one point, she told so many of us saying, "You're done. I don't think I can teach you anymore. Just get out of here and do the writing." What she also did was that she had a magazine that she started, found university was doing it. So she published all 5 or 6 of us who she was saying, "Go away now." And then we got out. She just abandoned us. And nobody could get published, and because we were all pushed out at the same time, it was easy to keep in touch. And we said, "What shall we do?" So we said, "Well, let's have a writers group." Then the writers groups keep on writing and critiquing each other's book, or writing, but nobody was publishing us. And at one meeting, I said, "Why don't we start our own magazine?" And they all look at me and saying, "What? Are you crazy?" And I said, "What does it take?" I mean, in those days, I was working more or less full time. So I said, "I can fund some of the money." And so hence, in 1994, Chicago Quarterly was born, thanks to me. And then, hence, I'm the founder of the magazine. And it took off. I mean, with humble beginning, now we are fairly respectable, if not prestigious magazine.
Hold up your copy. No, hold up the book. So hold up the book. Yeah.
And this is our latest big deal thing. I mean, it really is amazing. And it's a good way to talk about this issue, which was also my task to introduce the Chicago special issue. In some way, it was unfortunate that suddenly we have to have an anthology of Black American literature as if they are not. They're a separate group. I don't want to go into politics, so enough said. So it was said that after all these years, Chicago Quarterly was doing a special issue. But on the other hand, we also did this Italian issue, an Australian issue, a South Asian issue. So I guess we are all minorities, so we should represent ourselves. So I met Charles Johnson ages ago in passing. And I don't know how many of you know much about him. I'm not going to read his bio because I can just talk about him. He has written 25 plus books, novels, short stories, essays, screenplays. He is MacArthur Fellow. His books have been the Best American, and he's a professor, teacher, and most of all, one of the warmest men I've met in a very long time. A man of his stature took us in arm and produced this anthology, and this is what, you're meeting some of the panel members today. The writing we have here is amazingly good, and for the longest time, I thought I understood the plight of the Black American, whatever. It's hard for me to just go into this separation of the people, but he found and curated one of the best literature that I have seen. I mean, I'm not talking about Baldwin, but nevertheless, it's of that kind. I mean, it's a great anthology, and I think those who have read it found it equally impressive. Greg, I think
all right. Well, thank you so much for that background on the review, the quarterly review. It's my honor to introduce the panel, and then I'll hand it right back to each of them to speak. But before I go any further, I'd like to thank Craig Soter, who is here tonight, who planted the idea for this program. So he's the one who initially suggested this, and I'm so glad that we followed up on that suggestion. So
thank you, Craig. I don't know how I can do it.
Yeah. He's the one who really got the ball rolling, so hats off. So our speakers, our panel, from your right to left, Tsehaye Hebert. She's a nationally acclaimed citizen playwright and a cultural architect whose work nuances and centers the African-American experience. A lot in that. Her devotion to craft, inclusion, and access brings her unique voice to the fore with hybrid, quirky stories of Black American life. Next to her is Hughes. She received her Master's of Arts and Master's of Fine Arts from the Litzowitz Creative Writing Program at Northwestern University. She's been published in Guernica Magazine, Poet Lore, and Wilderness Magazine, among others. Her first manuscript of poems is titled Black Women Standing Ankle Deep in Pacific Water. Hope we hear all about that. And next to her is LeVan Hawkins. He received his MFA in creative writing from the Antioch University in Los Angeles. One of his areas of interest is the intersection of various writing genres with the art of performance. He's a recipient of several writing fellowships, including the MacDowell, and Hawkins is working on his memoir, and that will be titled What Men Do. Well, we should all read that. Tsehaye, please.
Yes.
Take it away.
What we are doing, everybody is going to be a little bit so that you understand the body of their work, and then we go into the panel discussion of the work.
You will forgive the writer, she did not tab her own story.
Well, we have another issue for that.
White, she said, as crisp as the name implied, the sound of a sheet drying in the sun and wind whipped on a perfect day, now having its corners popped for good measure. Black and gray were too maudlin, red too violent. The cans of spray paint held in her bosom like an amulet, she walked right up to the large marks covering one side of the wall of the fast food joint. The marks had been painted by his boys. The deceased's posse commemorated the lives lost. No matter what affiliation, what age, what side of town, caste, or class, there is no reason, no concept, no ideology that can explain away or condone murder. And one better be careful with that. Given the circumstances, the time of day, the zip code, and other factors, like the color of your uniform, it could go either way. I'll stop there.
I'm going to read some new work, but just to sort of situate my work. I'm taken, actually, gripped by memory, by history. And that's sort of largely what my first manuscript explores, is the intersection of familial history with the Great Migration to California, or the many Black migrations to California. But this poem is a little bit different from that. In this new work, I'm sort of exploring the precarities of queer love, one's attempt to try to love differently. This is titled, I Know Love by the Morning. My mother in a robe already has the cordless pressed to her ear. We've never said good morning, only insisted light be let in through dusty blinds. She fixes the silk scarf wrapped around her head. The edges of her graying hair behave like children refusing sleep. My mother has this old habit of ignoring me, though she wouldn't call it that. She would say, "You are my child who always lands on her feet. You don't need or want for anything." The first time I held a woman, I thought I would die from the fullness. The ache of hunger, so mundane to me, her body became an unappreciated miracle. I have made a habit of loving women for something other than what they are, burdening their flesh with the wholeness of my need. I need a way out of this regret. I need a way out of this child's desire for her mother. My mother now has hung up the phone. At the stove, she fries bacon and stirs a small pot of grits. Before she adds the cheese, she puts a bit in her mouth. She has prepared a meal enough for herself. I know love by this direction. You must make your own.
Okay. I've been working on artistic statement, project description for fellowships and grants, and it's the only time when I'm allowed to be as ambitious as I would like. They want to see a smart person. I don't have to hide it, and it's such a joy. And when you get there, to have the people over the residencies love you and respect you in a way that I just never have gotten. And they're building up my confidence. So lately, I've had to figure out what I wanted to talk about in my artistic statement. I'll start there. So it's a little longer than you guys. I don't know. They told me I could have a little time, so now I'm up here. So anyway, I'm just going to read this then, some of it. In the span of my creative life, I have been described as a poet, an essayist, performance artist, solo performer, public speaker, and actor. I consider myself to be a storyteller. According to Wikipedia, storytelling describes a social and cultural activity of sharing stories, sometimes with improvisation, theatrics, or embellishment. Every culture has its own stories or narratives, which are shared as a means of entertainment, education, cultural preservation, and instilling moral values. In my writing, most of it is in the first person. There is a constant mingling of the personal and the political. My ongoing quest of self-examination and personal development and the emotional, sociological, and institutional blocks that impact my quest are the subtext of much of my work. So in both sissies, my entry in Chicago Quarterly Review's Anthology of Black American Literature, I recall my youth when I did everything I could to fit in at church and school, including ostracizing a fellow member of my church who was gay like me. I knew that was going to happen, so give me a minute. Here's the big difference between Robert and me. I did everything I could to fit in. Robert did everything he could to stand out. A few weeks before, Robert had gone to our sister school to pick up Michael Washington, our church organist. For the occasion, Robert wore a woman's black fur coat that stopped midway his knees and ankles, large round women's glasses, and a bright red turban and matching gloves. Now, even if I owned that outfit, I would have known better than to wear it to a high school in the south suburbs of Chicago. Robert knew what he was doing. Then maybe he didn't. Maybe he did as everyone else did, instinctively gravitated to whatever attracted him, never realizing there were observers who would vehemently object to his choices. Dozens of laughing students gathered around him that day. A security guard had to break up the crowd. When I first heard the news, I wondered how Michael reacted when he saw Robert. Had he seen him and thought, what the hell? Had he worried people would see them walking together and think he was gay? Had anyone harassed them? Had he stood up for Robert? Or had he gotten so accustomed to Robert's ensembles, he simply saw what Robert was wearing as another one of his outrageous outfits? I couldn't be seen with Robert except while performing usher duties at church. My mother demanded my brother and I stay away from that Monroe boy who can't make up his mind whether he's a boy or a girl. Secondly, I felt I had done way too much work transforming myself to negate it by associating with Robert. If we were together, he would inevitably draw everyone's attention. Then they would broaden their lens and close in on me.
Well, thank you, everybody. This is how I think it works. We have prose, poetry, prose. The first time, the question would be from right to left, the next question from left to right, and she would always remain the number 2 because she's a poetry person, and it's not by an accident. We plan it that way. Okay, that being said, there's no time limit to how long you want to answer or take to answer your question. It's an open book test. The first question I have in mind, which I have written down here, is that writing is recording of the sound, sights, taste, thoughts, and feelings. How conscious are you in the process of writing it, when you're writing your work? And you can ask me the question again.
Well, I grew up in
I'm sorry?
I grew up in a home with a lot of music. And we call it an apartheid-free zone because my mother was a classic pianist, and we listened to Haydn and Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff, and we also listened to blues, and we listened to stride piano, and we listened to Professor Longhair. Let me say it right, Professor Longhair, and all the New Orleans music and Fats Domino. There was music everywhere. So I find that inevitably there is music playing when I write, and it depends on what I'm writing. I listen to opera when I write plays. When I write prose, I listen to jazz and blues. But I find that I don't believe in getting stuck. And what happens when I meet a challenge is I go in and sometimes I find a pathway with music. I thought it was a very apropos question because at School of the Art Institute, where I earned my master's, I would get lost in the museum, and everybody from Halprin, the architect, to Kandinsky, to Richard Hunt, really inspired me, and it became part of my process to really go deep into the dramaturgy when I wrote a play to make sure that I was listening to the music. I was looking at artwork, really immersing myself in that world. I find it less so when I write prose, but I find myself returning to that. And I now that you asked the question, I just realized that a lot of my recent work all revolves around music. And just listening to the sounds of the Deep South. I grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, which is on the Mississippi River. My mom was raised in New Orleans, but our family seat is in a really tiny town northwest on an oxbow of the Mississippi. So when you live in a place that has Mardi Gras and absolute black hole darkness in the outback, if you will, you grow up in this world of imagination. And to top it off, my dad he was the manager of a movie theater. So how could I not be a writer, right? So you come out the movie theater, you are listening to the songs in your head, you leave the movie theater, and then there's a band walking down the street, or marching down the street, or somebody sitting there playing a guitar, or the local high school decides that they're going to have an impromptu parade. So that's the kind of crazy, wild, wonderful audio world that I came from. And I hope it's my challenge as a writer to hope that I can bring some of that same audio clarity to my work. I want the work to sing and make the music that I heard growing up. So absolutely. And that was the choice, I think, when I read the section. I'm a jazz artist. I opened up that story in the middle of the story. Every time I read it, I might deal with something differently. But Syed, your question led me to go back and look at the color references, to listen to the sounds in the story that I had not really zeroed in on. So thank you for that question.
Can you repeat that list, the beginning list for me? Yeah. Can you repeat? I remember sight, sound, and what else was on the question?
The question is how aware you are with the sight, sounds, and taste in the process of your writing.
Yeah, so I am in the tradition poetically of Robert Hayden, Nikki Finney, those very tactile, Natasha Trethway, those very tactile poets. They love a good narrative, and they love a good image, and so do I. I'm very taken by that. I think in my first collection, I was particularly drawn to the landscape of California. Very different than the Midwest. which is flat, which I cannot really wrap my head around that there's not, mountain passes hundreds of miles in either direction. But I grew up with the Sierra Nevada. And one of the things that I feel like being particularly Black from the Bay Area, my grandparents were from Mississippi, Texas, Chattanooga, Aiken, and I was raised by Southerners by the Bay, which is so strange, I think, at times for people to understand. And so what I would see often, a lot of the time, is my grandmother behind her house in this very small, narrow backyard she would have, pulling tomatoes and telling me about how she used to hunt jackrabbits in the wood and then slice the tomato open for me and salt it and hand it to me. Or going outside and seeing the hills, the green hills in the background, or driving right over the hills and seeing the Sierra Nevada, which is one of the largest mountain passes in the world. And that's a particular kind of shaping, a sensibility, right? California is 2,000 miles away from here, almost. And it's also sort of guarded by these mountain passes. And then once you get over the mountain, it's the desert until you hit, it's the desert, and then it's prairie, and then the next major big city is Chicago. And I feel like at times people don't really understand the magnitude of that. And there's a section in my collection where I talk about slaves brought to California and how they walked that. Or, they walked the prairie, the desert, the basin, climbed over a mountain, and then worked in the mines for their slave masters. And then, or those who took a boat down the Atlantic up into the Gulf, walked across Panama, and then took another ship to San Francisco. And that is sort of like the difficulty at times. I'm taken by the landscape itself, the rigidness, its harshness, and how Black people contend with the land itself, and this travel and this forced labor, but also the necessity. I wrote a poem about a man who was brought to California, worked in the mine, basically bought himself. His master lied to him, sold him back south, and he walked back to California, bought himself again. He bought himself twice. And then bought the rest of his family. And I think at times when I'm looking at the image, if it's my grandmother having a tomato, salting it for me, the image is a pressure point for all the metaphors that have run out ahead of me from history itself. And so my work is often trying to zero in on the intense particularities of a place, of a person, and then out in that image trying to make it sing. And that's always the sort of difficulty of poetry to me, is how to make the image sing.
I think I'm going to talk about sight.
Okay.
I live in my head, really. People say things to me that I don't like. I go in my head and try to figure it out. If they say something I like, I go in my head and I try to figure it out. So I don't always see things. And my friends, I have a lot of artist friends, and they're like, you need to look at the world surrounding you, and I'm in my head. So I had two friends over the year. They would take me out like every weekend so I could see the world better, see those colors, see that, see this. And I think my lack of sight caused me to miss out on a lot. And when I was writing stories and essays, they didn't have a lot of visuals to them. And that was pointed out to me on a couple of occasions. So in this project, I decided that I was going to have scenes and with locations and a lot of stuff going on. And I wanted to show the beautiful world that Black people inhabit. A lot of people drive through my little small town and they just think it's so sad. And they don't know that we have teas and fashion shows. So I have a big, one of the big set scenes that I have are related to this fashion show, which I describe as being like a crackhead working in a crack house when you're gay and young, and it's just beautiful. So I tried to represent that in a variety of colors, you know, not just primary colors, but real specific pewter, you know, colors that you could just really see. And one of my main characters, he was a model in our show. He was my nemesis, and he had on yellow and gray, and he swooshed up and down the sidewalks, down the stage, and the announcer is just describing his colors, and he's kicking his feet and he's twirling around, and then he's walking so fast it looked like lightning was coming out of his ass. And but it was new for me. That was a whole new experience. Beautiful white linen-covered tables, cakes made to resemble hats, glamorous hats. So everything had a lot of glamour to it, in a place that people wouldn't think of it like that. So that's what I wanted to use. How I wanted to use it. I wanted people to see the kind of world that I come from, and. Leon Andre Talley from Vogue, he died, and he said, well, you know, Black people, you don't have to have money to be aristocrats. You know, you need an attitude. And that's what my mother and them, they didn't have a lot of money. My mother said she was poor, but at the same time, she said, associate with people in your category, you know. So I wanted to show that world, that it was a lot of glamour there.
The next question is about inspiration. Where does it come from? And how? Inspiration, where does it come from and how? And this time we'll go from this left to right. You have to be on the mic again.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah.
And it just blanked out. Everything just went. So now I got to.
Talking about inspiration.
Inspiration. You're
writing.
You know, when I wrote, I've written a variety of genres, but when some words were a poem, I knew that was a poem. It wasn't going to be anything else. It was real specific, and I don't know how to describe it. Essays is a whole different thing, and it's just like boy girl, this kind of situation. When they come in, you know what they are, and then you just work on them to make them beautiful. But yeah, so I miss when I want to be inspired. I don't need anything to be inspired. They just come. Whatever comes, that's what I'll write about. I have a book to work on. But lately, I haven't written any poetry. I haven't written any poetry in years, and that used to be all that I did. And my mother, she passed last September, and And I was watching a friend of mine read a poem about mothers, and just all these phrases and lines and descriptive sentences, they just came out, and I said, wow, that's a poem. I haven't had a poem in a long time. So what did I do? I lost it, and I can't find it, and it's driving me crazy, because now somebody in LA invited me to visit and do some poems on my mother, because they're all going to do poems on their mothers who have recently died. That should be a lot of fun. But we're going to go and try to work it out, because it's something that I guess we all go through one way or the other.
Yeah, inspiration is difficult. Speaking of mothers, my mother, who is still living, but I hesitate to say she's the inspiration, but she was definitely my first real conundrum. You know, as far as inspiration goes, I always think about this Toni Morrison phrase, quote, "You can't teach vision." And I think about that often, because poetry seizes you. The poem seizes you, sort of like grabs you by the neck and says, no, like you need to focus, at least for me, sort of you need to sit with this. And when I was really struggling or learning how to write poems, I was really unsettled by how poems are delivered to me, by how poems force me to, you know, this is predominantly, I think, the biggest difference that I noticed in prose. Please take no offense, but, you know, to get the right beat, to get the right image, the right metaphor, you have to press on the same thing over and over and over and over and over again until it is worked out like a knot on your back. And that is really, it's very painful, but at the end it feels very cathartic. And so that, it's less of inspiration like from a divine being, but more like this, you know, I write poems like, it's just a habit. Actually, at this point, I sort of just like, oh my God, like I have this feeling in my gut that needs to reach articulation, right? I mean, sometimes we forget this is all artifice. This is a sort of this feeling, this thing beyond our reaches that we are trying to massage or to deliver in language. And that's how I think about it, right? Things that seize you are poetry. And as the writer, as a poet, you're trying to say, how can I deliver this concisely? I'm always taken by the fact that poetry has no definition. That is like something I don't think people realize, like poetry has no definition. You can only talk about poetry by what it's not. Poetry is not this glass. Poetry is not propaganda. Poetry is not, you know, affiliation, right? You know, it's not this, but we can't ever locate it. And I think that's the difficulty of trying to talk about poetry and inspiration, because it's elusive. It comes to you like a shadow, and you're supposed to get to know it. Yeah.
Wow, that was really lovely, both of you. I want to pick up this whole notion of seizing. I hadn't written short stories in a while, and I started writing short stories again. I just went through my vault and thought, oh, I should have finished that. Let me look at this. But that short story is so pithy. You know, you have to get in, you have to get out. you can't linger in the same way you might be able to linger with a novel. But I will tell you that the inspiration for Off the Wall, the story that I wrote that's in the anthology, was trying to take apart, to deconstruct the idea, who is this woman standing on the corner of Howard Street? A perfectly looking middle-class woman painting the wall of a convenience store. I'm like, what is she doing there? Well, you know, and that idea, that image just really began to spin for me. How does she get there? Why is she there? What's going on? And I think I would agree inspiration comes from many, many different places. I couldn't really isolate, but I will certainly say that social conditions have really pushed the envelope for me to produce more short stories. They're shorter. I can get in there, I can say what I would like to say, and I'm excavating as I go along. I want to make sure that no two stories are alike in tone, in language, in structure at times. But there is this notion that music, I already told you, really influences me. I can hear a song and then a story might come out of that. But I don't know what the piece is going to be until I get in it. And it will tell me whether it is, I'm less inclined to write poetry now because I'm very long-winded. And as my teachers used to tell me, cut, cut, cut. So I'm learning brevity, writers, right? And learning to be a gracious editor and a revisionist. To put that story down and to come back and you know, I'm carving it. And I want to cut away things that don't belong there, and you don't know that until you, as you say, Erica, you have to get in there. You have to wrestle with that idea. But I would agree, inspiration comes from everywhere. I'm never at a loss for inspiration. I think I have too much going on sometimes, but I will not complain about that.
Well, next we are going to talk about techniques in writing, and I'll give you a few examples that we can talk about. Techniques, list making, first memory, early memories, lost domain, and my teacher who I'd mentioned, Mali Rami Nugent, her method was clothesline. What that she meant, I will start from the last one first, and then you guys will have to answer the question. Her method was that stories or novels, they don't come fully realized. You put one image, it's like you're doing a laundry and put it up there, and then you take the next piece and you shake it and you hang it. And if you keep on and you're writing, you'll possibly have a story, interconnected story or overall story. But that's just a technique, and it's not. Lost domain is a self-explanation, what's gone, and early memories and so on, which is, so this time we are going back to you again, and then we come back. And I have a few more questions, and this will be running short, so certainly I want to get to a few other questions.
I would say I use many different techniques, but what has served me well is an accumulation of information, of data. Terry Atkins calls it potential disclosure. He's a visual artist, a modern visual artist, and I collect stuff. I have boxes where I may collect a piece of fabric that reminds me of a character. I clip articles, and once that treasure box gets so full it's about to burst, that's when I know it's ready for me to dig in there. And I want all the space. I want two pots of coffee, and I don't want anybody to come into my studio and to disturb me because I'm the architect and I'm at work. I will say also I've gravitated to using more technology. I use the method of writing every day. I think it's a discipline. You have to get your butt in the seat. You have to sit down or stand, but you have to give the work what it wants. And it wants your full, total attention in a way that no jealous lover can ever compare with your writing. And finally, I'd like to say, I add with the technology, because it can be so laborious to sit and write, I started doing video journals. So every day I will play with language and I'll talk for about 3 to 5 minutes. And I don't look at it for a year or two, but I can literally go back and find the train of thought. Oh, that's the story I was working on. But I trained with the jazz musicians when I came here. I have a background as a dancer. So the exciting thing for me is that I don't know what the next step is. Let it rip. Let us play. Let's improvise. And let's see what happens. So it's about the play and the discovery for me.
I wish I was that free in my poems. I'm not, unfortunately. I do, when it comes to technique, I think I'm always surveying other poets and how they approach the poem. I love Ed Robeson's work. I am actually such a big fan of Ed Robeson. And his poetics and mine are just completely two separate.
Repeat that name.
Ed Robeson. His poetics and my poetics are on sort of two separate playing fields. And I always take inspiration from poets who use the caesura, who are not fixated by syntax, who are not fixated on upholding that the institution of Anglo syntax. And I come from a poetic tradition that definitely is like, I want this subject, verb, direct object, and I need, to figure that out. And I want, the double meaning when it comes to, between lines and all that stuff, all those good poetic techniques that they teach you, prosody, all those good things. How many lines is your poem? How many lines do you usually write in? I usually write between 9 and 15, right? Things like that. I'm very calculated. Unfortunately, I'm telling on myself. But I think one of the ways that I'm always technique to get myself out of the couplet, to get myself out of, this sort of stringent, symmetrical looking poem, I always look to poets who refuse that institution. And so one of the ways I do that is I put it in prose like they tell you in your MFA, but then trying to figure out how many commas can I take out and make this syntactically correct? How many words can I take out? What can I take out so that it sort of stands as its own sort of sculpture? And I think too, like also thinking about your own sensibility as a poet, particularly me, right? How can I undo the narrative as I also unfold it? Right? How can I undo the lyric narrative as I am also trying to push toward that? How can I interrupt the speaker as they to offer my reader some kind of surprise or like, wait, this is not what you think this will be. So I think a lot of, in terms of technique, memory, I can talk like a lot of that, but I'm sort of a nuts and bolts person when it comes to poetry. Thinking about the way that you relate to syntax, to the sentence, right? The poem the stanza as a unit of meaning, the sentence as a unit of meaning, the line as a unit of meaning. When I'm teaching, I'm always telling my students, of has a definition. Of has a definition. With has a definition. Things like that, trying to get myself to, I don't believe in the notion of purity, but as close as I can to that. So, yeah.
Okay, well, this goes back to being in my head again, because that's my residence. When something, I was going to say, is ready to birth, I guess the idea is ready to birth, the story is ready to birth. The idea is just, I don't write right away, I just think about it. And the next thing you know, I have all this stuff in my head. And if I don't let it out, I'll go crazy, I think. I don't know what's going to happen, but I write them down. I write down phrases, I write down names, I write down quotes, and I cut them up, put them on a little paper and cut them up and put everybody in their little group. And then I just try to figure it out. I take a piece over there and I start quilting. I quilt store phrases and names together, and the quilting creates patterns. My grandmother used to quilt with my grandfather's sister, and we would find little pieces of cloth all around the house. So that's what I do. And I have little pieces of paper all over the floor. And I just lay them out on the floor and try to put them in some kind of order. And it's like a miracle, really. It's almost like a miracle that anything comes out of this, but great stuff comes out of it. And it helps me. And I know something is going to come up. I already know something is going to come up. I don't worry about, if somebody tells me, a friend of mine, her son died. I was one of his mentors, and I went over his house to say, give my condolences. And she told me, she said, well, we need a poem. And I said, okay, I'll go home and I'll come up with something. And she said, no, do it right now. And I would say, they don't come up like that. They just, I need time to think about it. I got to take my walk and see what's in my head. She said, no, you sit right there and you think about him. And I didn't have a choice. So I sat right there, and about a half hour later, I had a poem. That was about 30 lines. So it comes. It's a magical thing. I hate to say magical thing, because when you say something is magical, that means you don't work at it. And I feel like I work like a crazy. I work a lot. So work is part of it. You have to have some kind of ethics. But it's like there's something telling my subconscious, write this stuff down. You're going to find the answers later. But I know whatever I do, the answer is going to come. I can have pieces of paper all over that floor that make absolutely no sense. But I know it's a story. I know it's a poem. I am not worried about it at all. And I guess it could be like your gift. A little bit. I hate to use phrases like that because we work so hard, but we do have gifts. At the same time, we're talented. We have gifts. Some people do other things. They cook and do this, but this is what we do. We take words and we pattern, we put them together, and we make things.
Thank you. This was hopefully not that complicated question. When did you start writing? What were your early experiences of becoming a writer? And again,
oh my God. Oh. Okay. I was 12 years old and I saw an ad for Writer's Digest. So without my mother's permission, without any money, I ordered me my first Writer's Digest, and I was about 12. And then the bills started coming, and my mother said, you would like to write so much, write them a letter and tell them you're 12 and don't have any money to pay the bill.
It gives.
Yeah. So she would give me a book now and then, but I don't know if she completely understood me because she did not. I had to, every now and then for Christmas, somebody would give me something, but no, she was just said, tell them you're 12. And my first play, I was in the 4th grade, and it was called Let All the Slaves Be Free. And Abraham Lincoln was black. This was way before Hamilton. But people just started asking me, did I want to be a writer? Kids would come up and say, you want to be a writer? You're going to be a writer? And I didn't, I hadn't even thought about it, but now I'm just making stories and stuff. And I kept writing, way beyond anything that I imagined.
I know you intended this to be a simple question, but this is not a simple question for me at all. Wow, how did I become a writer? I don't know. I'm going to try to give an impression of this story. I have a very complicated relationship with language. It was not readily available to me. I did not grow up in a household where I was read to. I went through California public school systems. My relationship with language is solely my own. But when the first time I left California was when I went to college, which again, complicated. When you grow up poor in California, you don't leave California. And so I had an opportunity to go to college in Iowa, of all places. It's very cold, colder than it is here. Oh, very small liberal arts college in Northwest Iowa on the border of Minnesota, Nebraska, and South Dakota. No. I was an English major, so we were reading Beowulf and Chaucer, and, that was a different world for me. And I just knew I needed language, stories, something. And so, again, they were like, a couple of my professors were like, hey, we're starting a creative writing club. And me, being the alien that I was in Northwest Iowa, surrounded by predominantly white people, I went like, what is this? Cool. And I had been jotting down poems, and I read a poem, and my professor looked at me, one of my professors, he looked at me, he said, Erica, are you going to get an MFA? I had no clue what an MFA was, and I said yes.
Oh, gosh. Oh, that's brilliant. I can't remember when and how I became a writer. I will tell you that my parents are both deceased, but they were bibliophiles. My dad read 5 newspapers a day. He read the New Orleans paper, 2 Baton Rouge papers. It's a state capital, so we had a morning paper and an evening paper. He read the godforsaken Congressional Journal every day. My father was the original nerd. He read Architectural Digest. He read everything. And of course, National Geographic were ubiquitous, Ebony, Jet. But I asked my siblings, did they ever remember learning how to read? And not one of us could remember learning how to read because we had been raised in such a print-rich environment. And you can't be from Southern Louisiana without having somebody tell you a story. If you ask them which way is the Schwegmans, they're going to give you a 20-minute story. It's just what we do. So story has always been a way of life for me. And I'm very proud of the fact that I'm the second great-granddaughter of Creole raconteur Dorlis Aguillard, who was a Creole folkteller. And I discovered that the folk tales and fables, African tales that I was using in my work, he, a formerly enslaved man, was telling those stories, and they're now in the archives at Tulane and at the Library of Congress. So to find that out and to find out that I have just picked up the baton in a way and continue to write is not a legacy that I take lightly. I grew up in a multilingual environment. My first language was literally French because my grandparents did not speak English. They abhorred English. And all of my great aunts and uncles, I never heard them speak English unless they were telling me to do something. And they would drop out of French Creole mid-sentence. But I never learned the language because it was the language of adults and they wanted us to blend in with the American culture. So part of my going back to childhood is doing some very deep memory work and remembering the stories and the nicknames that my parents gave us. But I never remember a time when I didn't have a pen or a pencil in my hand. They used to call me Little Black Nancy Drew. You know, here she comes with that notebook. And I was like, what's your name? Where did you come? I was interviewing everybody from the moment I think I could utter my first word.
We have one more question. I think this one is not going to be simple but I always wrestle with this one. When do you think you're done? And this one I would like to
I'm never done. You know, just to come here, I was going to read this excerpt from my piece. And I said, oh, I don't like that line. And I started cutting stuff out. But a lot of my friends do that. And I have a friend, I told one of my friends recently, you know, that a manuscript is a living organism. You know, it's constantly changing. You know, it's never the same. It just, you know, it's time the writer gets together with that script and then it's never done. I really believe that. Yeah. And I haven't written too many things that I think didn't need some work. Even my piece here is like, oh God, I wish I could go back in and cut some pieces. But you have to let it go because you just can't keep doing the same thing all the time. You have to have other plans and other visions, and you just have to move on.
Never, again, to reiterate that you don't finish a poem, you abandon it.
Now, if this was the other set, I would just drop the mic. I'm going to use the D word, deadline. That's your pause, right? But I share the same malaise with my cohorts here because you don't stop. And God forbid, and I'm going to step into the other room now. With theater, you are fixing that script up until you hit it. And it's that kind of joy that, no, take that line out, take that line out, let's do this. And I think it's that malleability. But I was totally ruined by the AACM, by Fred Anderson, by Ed Wilkerson, by Henry Threadgill, people I danced and worked with, because they always let me know that there was something more to excavate. Go back in, look at it differently, turn it around a different way. And I think that's the joy about it. Every time you go back and look at your piece, you go, But there's that humility, I think, that the work is bigger than you are. And at some point, you must let the work be on its own. You have to cut that umbilical cord at some point and let it do what it is supposed to do. If not, then it doesn't have the life that it should have. And you can live with saying, I could have used a better phrase there. And that's your space to grow. and to not be attached to everything that we write.
Audience question?
Yeah, let's just do the second part of it.
For any of the panelists who want to take it up, in your work by design, do you see it more specific to the Black experience, or do you strive for a universality of message?
Okay.
This is a very unpopular opinion. I am not a universalist. I think there are Black experiences that are very particular and precise. And I think at times we are so eager to say, I'm legible. But like from the poem I read earlier, not everyone knows what it means when I say, my mother's edges behave like children refusing sleep. That's not a readily like an image that like everyone wants it, like has access to that. And sometimes I want it that way. That doesn't mean that people don't have affective resonances with it, but it does mean that it is precise. I want to keep my people in my work. And at times, I know the kind of precarities it means to write a Black experience in a world that often denies Black experience. So I think that pressure to be universal is one that I dismiss. I want to write about my mother, and my mother is a Black woman from East Palo Alto, California. And so I'm going to write into that experience.
Man, where he go, Shay? He go by the other way? Or do we take a river bend, eh? If I can't talk to my grandparents and my family in the language that they live in and they cry in and they sing and they laugh in, then I've lost my connection to anything that is universal. Lorraine Hansberry once said that in the specific you find the universal. I am so taken, like my comrades here, with being able to excavate my own culture. That culture was denied me for so long, and I only have so many years left to do that work. So it is my joy. It is not my burden. It is my joy to go into my work. My work is like a big house. You can sit on the front porch and listen. You can sit in the backyard. You can peek in through the window. You can go in the basement. You can be in the closet. You can go in the attic. But there's a space in my house for everybody. But it's the house that I built. And it's the house that I inhabit. And I inhabit that house through my language and through my experience. So if I'm not specific and particular with that, then I've given you a broad brushstroke. And I think now more than ever, we need the specificity of every iteration of what it means to be an American, what it means to be in Chicago, what it means to be in New Orleans, Louisiana. We need desperately those stories. They live in the specificity.
I grew up in Robbins, 20 miles south of here. It's 90, when I was growing up, it was like 90-something% Black. I could tell you where every white person in the town lived. We had some. I write about the people that I knew there, and it's a mix. It's not just one thing. It's tons of things. There's tons of different Black people. It's not one Black thing. It's like Black people that are bougie or whatever you want to call it. You got your poor people. You got your street people. You got your religious cultures. You have all these different cultures. You have class wars. You have all this stuff going on. So why would I go outside when I could have all of that? And but you know, when I was in LA, I got stopped by the police, and I wrote about it. You know, that's what I do. I write about personal stuff. So I'm not necessarily, I'm writing about racial stuff because I'm a black man and stuff happens to me, and you will hear it when I read. And I'm gay, so I write about being gay and how and what that's like. And you know, one time I'm just talking to a man in my story, but I didn't say he was a man. So this woman thought I was talking about some woman, but it's just I'm writing about my life, and I don't need another life. I mean, I need another life, yeah, to do it. It's just like it's so many people in my town. They have enriched my life and given me counsel, and they've taught me that you can be anything you want right here in this town. And I just took up on it, and I just go. So I don't. It's not like I'm a we are the world, we are the children kind of guy. You know, it's you come to my birthday party, it's like the United Nations. That's how I go down. But when I write my story about taking care of my nephew, he's black and I'm black, and as we we have a way of talking to each other that we wouldn't talk to another white person like that. So. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. No, the notion of being universal, I love being universal. I love Martin Luther King. But I'm cool with who I am. But I do think about race. I think about race a lot. How could I not? Especially now. So how could that not come out of my work? But I don't write a lot about general stuff. I write about personal stuff. And I try to, and this one, critic said it's highly personal but universal. So if you can get that, that's good.
Do we have any more questions here?
Yeah, I just want to make a comment. I don't know the gentleman, but I just think that there's a lot of universality in the Black experience that the rest of us need to understand. So I wouldn't have asked the question quite the same way.
Well, go ahead.
The African-American literary tradition in Chicago is very rich, all the way from Richard Wright and LeVan D Brown to, you mentioned Lorraine Hansberry, Haki Madhubuti. In any sense, do you see yourself fitting into a tradition, or do you see yourself individualistic as a writer today, and you just happen to fall into that tradition when somebody put together an anthology like this one, which is a great anthology?
I just want to make a comment briefly. The very fact that after all these years, we are still doing this anthology of Black American literature speaks a lot about how we live. And I am one of those persons who's lost. I was born in India, and passed for white, passed for black, whatever, but there's something unique to your own culture and your own people. And in America, it's unfortunate that we are all American, but we are so divided in terms of color. Not all of us, but generally speaking, that's true. And I'm sorry, yeah, go ahead.
I write in a tradition. I'm thinking about Phyllis Wheatley and the complication of 'twas mercy that brought me from my pagan land. And I'm always thinking about the ways in which Black articulation has been precarious over centuries, and how we all make these negotiations, but also, I should make an aside. I'm getting my PhD in philosophy, so I think very deeply about these things. So I think a lot of it, you know, this question of universalism, I want to complicate that, what that means, right? If I say I'm not a universalist, does that mean I don't fit into a tradition? No, it means I am writing in a tradition. I'm writing in a tradition that has to make negotiations with the genre that is handed to us. And that is something as a writer, I take up very seriously, what it means to write after Countee Cullen, to write after Alice Dunbar Nelson, to write after Lucille Clifton, Gwendolyn Brooks. Each region, each person in different times, Audre Lorde, even more contemporary writers like Patricia Smith, like Viby Francis, we are all sort of approaching this thing, the lyric. And to me, that question of writing in a tradition is, what tradition am I relating to the lyric? In what tradition am I relating to the lyric? And to relate in the tradition, in a Black tradition, a North American Black tradition to the lyric is different than the Caribbean lyric, right? It's different than, it's different across the diaspora, right? Different conceptions. And I think that's something where these discussions about universalism often get generalized, which is something I, as a writer, obviously, I'm like, no, we don't want to generalize. But who are the voices that guide me, right? Who are the voices that guide me? Who are the voices that maybe not guide me, but place me in a conversation. And I think that's how I think of, no one's so special that they're doing completely their own thing. That's the complication of aesthetics in general, is that you're always talking to someone, you're always phoning out to someone, even if it's not, sonically. And so that's how I sort of think about tradition.
Wow, that's a toughie. I would say that I feel incredibly privileged and incredibly blessed to have studied with people like Jan Carew and Sterling Stuckey, Ibrahim Singh Diata. These are people taught at Northwestern, Amari Evans, Cyrus Coulter, Dennis Brutus was my professor. I was Maria Moutry. Leon Forrest, the late novelist Leon Forrest was my lunchtime companion for the last 2 years of my college career. And I sat at his feet and literally just, consumed every word, every comma, every thought. So I feel a great responsibility, a joyful responsibility, because I'm part of a lineage that goes as far back as time. And that lineage was broken, the language was broken. So the fact that we are bridges, we are doorknobs, we are opening doors, we are connecting people in ways makes us a part of a mighty tradition. It's an oral tradition, but it's a very heavily written tradition. Just think about the thousands of books and hundreds of thousands of books in Timbuktu, when people think that the tradition of Africa is strictly an oral one. It is multi-language on many, many different levels. And as part of that tradition, and being able to, I knew my great-grandparents who were young children when chattel slavery ended, my great-great-grandparents. So I feel beholden to carry that tradition forward and to talk about the things that they were not able to talk about. But now I'm blessed enough to be able to have the language, to have the training, to have the platform, such as this, to be able to share that. But I feel definitely very much a part of that tradition and a proud part of that tradition.
Thank you. I think we better wind it up, but we can stay a little bit after, have another drink, have some hors d'oeuvres, and continue these conversations. But that was really wonderful. You've given us so much, so much. I'm gonna go home and think about quilting as a metaphor for writing, and I'm gonna work on my abandonment skills to drop the article and abandon it. And I'm going to start a treasure chest and put articles, quotes, and even fabrics in it. So this has been a great, great panel. I really appreciate you all coming. Thank you so much.